Ready? I just record the first, say, 15 or 20 minutes for the talk part. And then when we do the breakouts and the move into cafe mode, I'll stop recording. And by the way, Zoom doesn't record breakout rooms anyway, unless someone hits record in the breakout room. So
it seems to sometimes do it and sometimes not. I've had some meetings where it followed me into the breakout room, and when I joined the breakout room as a host, it did record what happened in that breakout room where I was in automatically, but it doesn't always seem to do that.
My guess would be host. If you are host, it probably follows you. I guess the thing to watch for is in the upper left-hand corner, or at least on my screen, it's upper left. I guess it depends on your device. It should have that flashing red light if it's recording, so that can be a heads up. All right, so then maybe I'll get started here. Thank you all for dialing in. What this group is a monthly virtual knowledge cafe. So very similar to the World Cafe approach. What we try to do is have someone offer about 15, maybe 20 minutes of content, and then we'll break into random breakout rooms. I'm gonna mute everybody just for some background noise. Second. There we go. So we'll do about 15 or 20 minutes of content, and then we'll do 3 15-minute random group, small group breakouts. And then after those 3 breakouts, we'll come back as a full group to talk about today's prompt, today's question, which I've got in front of me is, how can knowledge management increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially in the startup landscape? So it's a blend between KM, D&I, from a startup perspective is the idea. And today we've got a shared friend. In fact, I see Jamie is on the call here. Jamie introduced me to Ariana, what, a year or 2 ago, or has it been 3 now? Time, maybe more, time flies, maybe 3 years. So time flies. And I guess candidly what I would say is the 3 of us immediately dove into quite a trusting, friendly, candid conversation. And ever since then, I've tried to keep up with Ariana and all the amazing work she does. So I think with that, Ariana, over to you.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. And let's get started. I like to preface this first by saying that this is going to be an informal conversation. So I'm going to cap myself at 15 minutes just so that we can really dive in. I love hearing people's thoughts, perspectives, and input onto diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to give some background of myself before we jump into the framing, right? My name is Ariana Abramson, conscious tech expert, social entrepreneur for about 5 years, as well as the founder and CEO of DivySci. And what DivySci is doing, and what I do, is really look around the future of STEM work. So I can preface this with a simple blank statement and say the future of work and the future of STEM work in particularly rely heavily on core competencies around diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, as you've seen in the news, in the media, and pretty much every email that comes into the inbox, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because it is a big word and feels super, super loaded. And in fact, I think what happens when we start having these tough conversations around that is that it seems like they can be interchangeable, or even more so that they are inevitable. And I will challenge that briefly by saying, I want to define it with you all today. And then I want you all to take this back and begin to place it into your daily lives. So let's start with the easier word, right? Let's start with diversity. Diversity in its most basic form is variety, right? It's saying if we're in a room, who are the stakeholders and the people in the room? What makes them different? And what is the variety around that, right? And what's easy about that word is that we are seeing a changing landscape within the startup and innovation space that's becoming apparent, right? But the challenge starts with the other 2 words, inclusion and equity, right? So then when we think about inclusion, which is the next step of diversity, we're saying, let's make sure we incorporate people, right? Like, let's make sure we incorporate them to the table, to be stakeholders, to be validated in their opinions, right? And that's beautiful. In fact, when we think about D, E, and I, inclusion is key. However, we're missing equity. And equity is the word that I am most fundamentally looking to understand, solve, and begin to build. And why I say that is that equity in its most basic concept, use the dictionary and look it up, means fair, just, and impartial, right? So when we think of the word equity again, look it up, it says fair, just, and impartial. However, when we start thinking about equity in terms of innovation, the future of work, and education, it is a step further. And this is where it gets complicated, because equity is not just about being fair, just, and impartial. In fact, when we think about changing systems, technologies, and looking at community building, it's about first identifying, what do we need? So what do you need as an individual? What does your community need that you're serving? And what do founders need? What do founders need? And what do their clients need? And then once you understand their needs, which can be access, right? Access to knowledge, access to resources, access to support, you have to then figure out where they are. So where are they on that needs spectrum? Can you identify, do they understand their needs? Do they understand how to get there? Are they almost there? And then the last part is making sure that there are systems in place to help them get to where they want to go. So that is humongous, and I'll continue to break that down for you in 2 examples that have been showing up since COVID-19 and the pandemic. Many people that I've spoken to have children, and children in school. I personally don't, however, many people do, or younger siblings, right? And then when we looked at what happened in COVID-19, is that it fundamentally altered the way we learn and the way we work. So when we think about that in terms of students in academia, it's a very simple example. Family, teachers, academia had to change, right? They had to say, how do we become virtual? And in itself was a challenge, because families, systems, priorities had to shift. But then what started to become apparent, which was already underlining there, right? But what started to become apparent was systemic racism, systemic prejudice, and systemically inequitable opportunities. And why I say that is that from the bare basics, we're asking students to log on to Google Meet or Classroom, but some students don't have access to laptops. Some students don't have access to internet. And then when we think about that and the future of work, how does not having access to fundamental basic needs continue to perpetuate inequity in school systems and the future of work? And then let's take that a step further, right? So let's look at the future of work. Let's look at technology, innovation, and startups. I'm sure you've seen on the news lately when we have these humongous startup giants like Amazon, like the CEO of Twitter, Mark Zuckerberg, and Facebook. They have built a foundation of technology and have worked tirelessly to begin making sure they have diverse talent in their pipelines, diverse access to different communities, higher education, HBCUs, right? Because they thought being diverse will begin to help change conversations and narratives. And what they didn't do well, and what they fundamentally missed, is the term equity, right? Because within their diverse recruiting pipeline and access, they missed the ball in understanding how to fundamentally design networks that are effective, that are efficient, and that can meet the needs not only of their employees, but of their external stakeholders, the people who use these platforms. And because they didn't, I'm sure you all have seen the recent news on Facebook employees walking out, Twitter employees flipping out. All these things are happening because we have to realize that being diverse and bringing diverse people to the table does not fundamentally lead to inclusion and equity when we make decisions as stakeholders. And that's where we come in, right? So this is where my organization, my work, and my interests have been lying. And it's really understanding at its core, what are the gaps of knowledge that are continuing to exacerbate a need to build equitable landscape of opportunities, technology, resources, and systems. So with that being said, the biggest question that I have continued to look at, and my team continues to look at, is how do we influence outcomes? Because in its basic and most fundamental principles, what we're looking at is how can we influence an outcome that feels inclusive and equitable, both in work and in education. And I've been asked this question from many stakeholders. I've been asked by local government officials. I've been asked by school districts. I've been asked by innovation hubs to answer this question. And I can say and preface this where there's no one answer. In fact, when we continue to make this into a one-dimensional problem, we will continue to miss the mark. So when I think about answering this question, and when you guys think about answering this in your local communities, institutions, and practices, you have to understand the design dimensions, right? In its most basic form. What are the structures that are currently in place and how are they influenced? When we look at school, work, and play, how is that in itself building a culture of dynamics and norms, right? What are the patterns? When we ask school officials or even innovators, what are your patterns and your structures? What are the behaviors that enforce these patterns? And lastly, what are your goals? When we think about diversity, inclusion, and equity, specifically in the startup landscape, it becomes this trademark word or group of words that make it seem like we're trying to address the needs of everyone. And in fact, by doing so, what we start to begin to challenge is our humility, right? Because are we being conducive to satisfaction, trust, and connecting with outside people, ideas, and resources? Are we being disingenuous in how we continue to build technology and systems that in itself are not asking our stakeholders what they truly need? And lastly, if we think about this from a revenue generating perspective and the future of work, how do operations, learning, and sustainability truly lead to a more equitable landscape that in itself can bring future innovation, social change, community activism, and building? And to help address this, to really help think about how I can frame it in my head, and hopefully it'll help you frame it, is think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we think about this pyramid and we think about the steps that he's described that a basic human needs to feel psychologically safe, heard, and self-actualized, in its most basic, we talk about safety, security, love, and belonging, right? And that in itself may seem super easy to understand, right? You want to feel safe, you want to have resources, you want to have community. But what you have to understand is that last piece, when we think about self-actualization, what I've begun to see is self-actualization can be on par with equity. When we think about self-actualization, what we are saying is that a human, a community, or groups of people are fundamentally able to address, understand, and identify the needs they need from resource standpoint, community education standpoint, to continue living their best selves. And what that means as well is when we think about equity, it is the same notion that we are able, once again, to identify who we're solving for, what they need, and where they are, and how they can get there. So my theory and our idea is really simple, right? It's taking this all these concepts and ideas, and boiling it into one sentence. When we think about our shared theory of change, it is an equitable shared theory of building, innovating, and serving by identifying your key stakeholders. And this concept, when we think about, the last part of my discussion and talk, is around next steps and pitfalls. Organizations, educational systems, governments are all asking themselves, how do I meet the mark? How do I make people happy? And the biggest question that they fail to identify and answer is, what is their shared theory of change as leaders, as people in places of power, that people that can move the needle? How do you identify your shared theory of change? Most people will have conversations about DE&I and talk about what environmental structures need to change, what culture change needs to look like, how specifically diverse people need to feel like they're bringing their holistic self to work. And when I hear those topics, it's very interesting to me. And I say interesting from the fact of, from a larger organization to startups to innovation hubs that all are built kind of differently, but still are trying to solve this problem. We want to understand from a more tangible expectation of, how do you measure results and outcomes? When we talk about bringing holistic selves to work, when we talk about doing culture changes and norms, people are like, where's the tangible outcomes? How do we look at results? How do we measure that this is the right step or right pathway? And then, we can talk about this from a corporate governance standpoint. I have CEOs and stakeholders that say, do we need to restructure our boards? Do we need to innovate new pipelines to get new workers into our organization? Do we need to overhaul the HR systems because we're not sure if they're working? And the funny part about this is that we continue to miss the mark, right? We're continuously looking for system changes instead of fundamentally knowing that we are coexisting in this space, in organizations and in communities. So what is your motivation? What is your shared theory of change? Putting band-aids on solutions, building new systems, building new networks, all help if you are aligned with your shared theory of change. And I boiled them down into a few questions that I asked startups, that I asked organizations, and that I asked entities to help build this. I say first, what is your vision, right? What do you envision the future of work will look like within your organization, within your school dynamic setting, within your community? And who are your clients? So if you envision something grandiose, if you envision equity and diversity and inclusion for all, boil that down. What are you trying to hit? And who are the clients that would benefit or receive that? And then lastly, not just thinking about clients, who's your audience? So as you all know, we have ripple effects within our community. We have ripple effects in the organizations that we run. So when we think about our client interactions, our client facing ideas, who's our audience? Who are those employees that work for us, right? Who are those people and board members that serve us, that we are accountable for? And how are they going to start understanding and start appreciating this shared theory of change? And lastly, when you think about these people and when you identify your clients, your community, and your audience, what do they want? Don't take the fundamental misstep about thinking that they want to bring their holistic selves, that they want all these system changes, because in fact, what you're missing is the key aspects around asking them what they want. Ask them, do they want belonging? Is it community? Is it access to opportunities? Is it to be part of a human-centered design approach? And from there, what you'll be able to see is that you'll be able to move the needle in a more tangible way, be able to put metrics that can be aligned, and lastly, make sure that you are part of the solution and not the problem. And I will lastly say, when I wrap this whole big idea into a tangible action item for you all, is to continue to engage in dialogues, but resist the savior complex. As leaders, as thought leaders, as people in power, we have this fundamental need to try to solve based on what we think we know and what we think people want. resist it. In fact, don't even do it. Instead, be a part of dialogue, elevate, and elevate. And lastly, when you are part of dialogues, add value where you can. Stay in your lane, and that is the most basic way that I'll say. Do not say you know something about a community, a space, resource, or innovation when you have no way to empathize or sympathize with the situation. Add value where you can, stay in your lane, and continue to resist the urge of the savior complex. And that's all for my spiel at the moment. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this helps build out for our conversations in our breakout rooms when we talk about how KM can really move the needle in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the innovation framework.